once you're at the fair, I know it will be an experience that all Americans and all visitors will be proud of and think of for many years.
Many of your contributions have introduced new words to our vocabulary. Your most recent is audio animatronic. I hope I'm pronouncing
That's
that
right. It's, sound, animation through electronics.
We have roamed these United States and literally combed the globe for pavilions and exhibits which will reflect the achievements of all men in industry, culture, the arts, and harmless entertainment.
The 1964-65 New York World's Fair was a reflection of life in the United States in the mid-20th century. Industry was booming. The space race was intensifying. And the middle class was thriving. Millions of Americans were headed to New York City. But they weren't headed just to Manhattan or Times Square. They were also headed to Queens, home of the 1964-65 New York World's Fair.
To those who attended the World's Fair, it was a huge success because it somehow promised a bright, happy, technologically advanced future.
We had Tony Stark going through the Unisphere because it's something that's important to us and it's important culturally.
It wasn't all rose-colored glasses, though. The fair occurred on the brink of cultural change, amid political turmoil, and just as American involvement in Vietnam was beginning to escalate.
You'd see newsreels of what's going on and people fighting, and being 6 at the time, I didn't understand that. It's just, how come everybody's shooting at each other, not knowing that this is the time we're in and the volatility of it. Going to the World's Fair, everybody gathering at the same place, looking at stuff, nobody trying to take your purse, nobody fighting anybody else, just a happy experience. The Beatles sang about love, everything was happy, and why can't we do this every day? There's nothing wrong with doing this every day.
The moment we drove up and we were coming down the highway and we saw the spectacular buildings rising above the horizon as we approached, I was just amazed. Every way you looked, especially as a child, everything was so different and so large.
The fair was more than a reflection of what we wanted the world to be. It was a mile-wide time machine.
Laptop computers, radar ranges, things like this. This is just all a bunch of bunk. This is all stuff for science fiction magazines. And I think when you look at it, really, what the '64 World's Fair predicted maybe isn't as far off as what we thought it was at the time.
Going to the fair and actually being able to touch the exhibits and use them, I think was a real eye-opener because there was a lot of really great technology that was on display for the first time.
Visiting the fair, you could see color television, video phones, a computer search engine. The amount of technology to take in one day far surpassed today's much-hyped tech product launches.
The fair sought to celebrate the boundless possibilities of technology and scientific innovations of that era.
There were also visions of future architecture, transportation, city planning, and it was a cultural melting pot.
It's an opportunity to experience cultures, ethnic food, and various parts of the world that maybe you would never get to see. Where could you go and see the treasures of Egypt, of Pakistan? Spain had some beautiful carvings. So you would be able to sample and experience firsthand some of the treasures that you would have to go around the world to experience. You get a chance to see the best that a country had to offer.
Today, 50 years later, the fair and the exhibits from it influence our lives in countless ways. From communications to computers and pop culture to cultural understanding. This is the 1964-65 New York World's Fair. The World's Fair Corporation, the group of New York businessmen behind the creation of the fair, chose Robert Moses, New York's master builder, to lead the corporation. Moses had a history of getting projects completed, no matter who or what stood in the way. The fair was to take place in Flushing Meadows, on the same site as the 1939-40 World's Fair. For Moses, it represented a chance to follow through on the failed promise of the first fair, a way to generate enough money to leave Flushing Meadows Corona Park as a lasting park for the city. To generate enough revenue, the corporation estimated and expected 70 million visitors to the fair. To do so would require the fair to operate for 2 seasons in violation of the rules established by the BIE, the organization responsible for designating official world expositions. The lack of recognition from the BIE meant that BIE countries were barred from participating. Still, 58 countries were represented in some manner at the fair, many via privately funded pavilions, allowing countries to boycott the fair and be part of it at the same time. For the millions who traveled to the fair, the exposure to other cultures was unmatched.
The feeling or the vibe of wonderment, meeting people from all over the world and seeing things that I never would see.
And to walk into a pavilion and talk to somebody that was from Germany, or hear somebody from Ireland or somebody from Egypt, that was pretty exotic.
The fair also gave Americans a chance to learn about places closer to home. Montana played up its rugged Western image. Pennsylvania touted its role in the founding of the nation with a full-scale Liberty Bell replica. The exotic state of Florida beckoned visitors with a giant orange perched upon a tower, while a water ski show highlighted the fun to be had in the Sunshine State. The island state of Hawaii offered a 12-course luau. While the igloo-shaped Alaskan Pavilion provided a glimpse into the lives of Alaskan natives. The gift shop sold items handcrafted by Alaskan women. The New England States Pavilion offered a look at the shared history and culture of Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Vermont. Small hexagon-shaped buildings connected together to form the pavilion. While the state and country pavilions provided insight into other cultures and regions, it was the industrial area exhibits that captured the imagination.
You look at these pavilions that they built. Here you have these incredible architectural structures that really represent the United States at its high water mark as far as industry was concerned. We were the world's leaders in aerospace. We were the world's leader in electronics. We were the world's leader in the automobile industry. And I mean, it really represents a high watermark for us as a whole.
The outside of the IBM Pavilion mimicked the style of the golf ball-shaped typing head of the then popular IBM Selectric typewriter.
The IBM exhibit was sort of like an egg sitting up on stilts, and I was fascinated by the fact that it had what looked like a stadium seating that would be like for an IMAX movie, and it went up through a slot in the bottom into this egg, and I thought, you know, that's really clever because you got this stack of people and you insert it up into the egg and then there's a show.
The pavilion was designed by the firm of renowned architect Eero Saarinen. Inside, a multi-screen film conceived by the famed designers Charles and Ray Eames hinted at the multisensory, multitasking world to come. DuPont wowed audiences with The Wonderful World of Chemistry. The show seamlessly blended live actors and pre-filmed performers for a series of dance numbers.
With nylon and stretches across each happy face.
Next, visitors entered a space of dazzling live experiments.
You walked in and all of a sudden you were in this big oversized laboratory and people were experimenting.
Flawlessly done. Thank you, gentlemen.
In 1964, Eastman Kodak was manufacturing over 80% of the world's film stock. People were sharing Kodak moments, so it was only natural for Kodak to be part of the fair. 5 huge prints with unprecedented clarity caught fairgoers' eyes. The prints were changed every few weeks to avoid sun fade and bring variety to the display. Kodak also enlisted Emmett Kelly Jr. to appear as his clown character, Weary Willie. Kelly went on to be a goodwill ambassador for Kodak, becoming the most photographed clown in history. Bell Telephone's floating wing-shaped building was one of the many architectural marvels.
It was 400 feet long by 200 feet wide. It was 87 feet high, and it was raised 24 feet off the ground and sat on 4 pylons. And a series of moving chairs, which had a surround sound system that people could adjust and listen to the narration. And they would go through a series of scenes, learning about the evolution of communications, from smoke signals all the way to the Telstar communications satellite. The point was really to showcase the state of the art, all of the products and services that was transforming American life.
While science, technology, and industry were key components of the fair, there was also a large dose of faith. The ornate Vatican City Pavilion housed Michelangelo's Pieta, on loan from the Vatican.
When you would see it, you were on a moving sidewalk. And to stand there and look at something that Michelangelo did, and to look at the little chips of where he hand-tooled that, you would just feel that tingle in your spine.
Other religious pavilions included Billy Graham's self-funded display, the Protestant Orthodox Center, Sermons from Science, and the Russian Orthodox Church. The Mormon Church created a 3/4-size replica of the Mormon Temple in Salt Lake City.
I saw the Coventry Cross, which was a cross that was burned when they bombed the Coventry Church. And there was a large wooden cross above the altar. And to stand there and see it at the fair, to go to London and stand and see it back in the church, that's pretty powerful.
The fair was appealing to religions, as Robert Moses refused to charge them rent. The world of finance was also represented. American Express displayed the money tree. The tree leaves were made of different currencies with a combined worth of over $1 million. Equitable Life offered a sobering display, a 44-foot-long counter keeping track of population growth in the U.S. with what was termed an exact count of the U.S. population. Travelers Insurance created a large pavilion that mimicked its famous umbrella logo.
Welcome to the Travelers Insurance Company's exhibit. You are about to start on an unforgettable journey. The triumph of man.
13 dioramas showed the progression of man from cave dweller to space traveler. Other companies were happy just to be part of the fair. The fair was also a battleground and testing ground for different building materials, vying to be the future construction material of choice. United States Steel was thrilled to be behind the icon of the fair, the Unisphere.
Unisphere, the largest representation of our globe ever attempted. Unisphere, the largest stainless steel structure yet built. Stainless steel. Why? Because it is to become a permanent landmark, Unisphere must be virtually maintenance-free, yet remain enduringly beautiful.
There were also scrappy newcomers like fiberglass, which was on display prominently in its multicolor capabilities. And then there was the House of Formica, that aimed to prove any surface could be better when it was covered with Formica. Formica hoped to convince visitors to build their own Formica home, and teamed with 25 builders across the country to build World's Fair model homes. America wasn't ready for the all-Formica home, though. The remaining Formica homes have been largely remodeled, hiding their past. Organizations also saw the fair as an opportunity to reach a huge audience.
As one company would sign up, their competitors would look over and say, I better get a piece of that too. So there were all sorts of people that were rushing to have a little space of some of the shared pavilions, like the Better Living Center, that sort of thing, that even if you couldn't afford your own pavilion, you had to have some sort of presence at the fair.
Over its two-season run, 51.6 million people attended the fair, a number far lower than the projected 70 million visitors. In October 1965, with the close of the fair approaching, attendance surged as people hoped to get one last look at the spectacle. On October 17, 1965, the last visitors filed out of Flushing Meadows Corona Park. Demolition crews moved in, and the fair was left to live in the memories of those who attended. The New York World's Fair was gone forever. Or was it? Robert Moses intended for the fair to be a gateway to a vast improvement to Flushing Meadows Corona Park. Part of that plan involved leaving certain buildings and landmarks for future enjoyment. The United States Pavilion, or Federal Pavilion, was a massive building with 150,000 square feet of show space. Science fiction writer Ray Bradbury wrote the narration to The American Journey, the main attraction of the U.S. Pavilion. Floating 20 feet off the ground on 4 giant pillars, the building was constructed thanks to a $17 million appropriation by Congress and signed by President Kennedy.
I want the people of the world visit this fair and all the various exhibits of our American industrial companies and the foreign companies who are most welcome, and to come to the American exhibit, the exhibit of the United States, and see what we've accomplished through a system of freedom.
President Kennedy was assassinated prior to the fair's opening day. Part of the United States Pavilion became a tribute to him. When the fair ended, the federal government retained ownership of the structure. For years, the building sat in Flushing Meadows, awaiting a new use. By the 1970s, it became apparent one would not come. By the summer of 1977, the United States Pavilion was gone. Other pavilions had a brighter life after the fair. Fairgoers became enamored with a little film presented by S.C. Johnson. To Be Alive highlighted the simple joy of, well, being alive.
I think that was really a wonderful look at people at play around the world. He did a beautiful job.
Using a unique 3-screen process, the film opened with a look at modern life's hectic pace, then took the audience back to their childhoods, when imagination and joy were found at every turn. To Be Alive highlighted the universal nature of that joy across cultures. The inspiring film went on to win an Academy Award for Best Short Documentary in 1966. The film was shown inside the Golden Rondelle, S.C. Johnson's UFO-like building suspended in the air. When the fair ended, the Golden Rondelle was spared from the wrecking ball, and S.C. Johnson decided to move it to their corporate headquarters in Racine, Wisconsin. Today, the Golden Rondelle serves as an auditorium and meeting space. Once a week, the fair comes back to life as the Golden Rondelle holds a public screening of To Be Alive. Speaking of Wisconsin, the state of Wisconsin chose to highlight its Native American history with a pavilion featuring a teepee-like structure. Tile work depicted the first residents of the state. Behind the teepee structure, a large steel building hosted Tad's, a steakhouse with broiled steaks for $1.19. Today, that steel building lives on as the cafeteria and general recreation space of Camp Ramah, a kids' summer camp in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. Wisconsinite Ivan Wilcox bought the TP portion of the pavilion and moved it to Wisconsin. He sold it in 1966 to Central Wisconsin Broadcasting, a family-owned radio station in Neillsville. The radio station studios are located in an addition to the building. The main portion operates as a gift shop with a wide assortment of Wisconsin cheese. Coca-Cola chose to highlight the different places around the world that loved Coke. Coke showed diorama-like scenes of exotic lands. The concept of the far reach of Coke and the shrinking nature of the globe was punctuated by an amateur radio station where ham radio operators communicated with others around the globe. The idea of Coke's worldwide reach will be replicated years later with the World of Coca-Cola exhibit in the company's hometown of Atlanta, Georgia. In what seems like a marketing oddity today, the main attraction for many at the Coke exhibit was the Bell Carillon.
And here is the world's largest electronic carillon. More than 600 bells.
Rising 120 feet, the Carillon was billed as the largest in the country. In Georgia's Stone Mountain region, the bells still chime, donated to Stone Mountain Park by Coke. The tower may have changed, but the bells ring on. Despite its relative obscurity at the fair, the New England States Pavilion survives today. In South Portland, Maine, the hexagons form a small and nearly empty shopping center, no indication of its former life on the world stage. Given the popularity and fame of a certain landmark in St. Louis, it's not surprising that a relic of the fair lives in its shadow without anyone noticing. The Spain Pavilion boasted a large collection of sculptures and paintings, many in the United States for the first time. Life magazine dubbed the attraction the jewel of the fair. St. Louis Mayor Alfonso Cervantes saw an opportunity to add another landmark to the city's plans for the Arch and the new Busch Stadium. The Spain Pavilion was seen as the third leg of an attraction trio designed to put St. Louis on the international map. A parade heralded the opening, and thousands visited the building that first summer. But the crowds didn't keep coming. It soon became apparent that the pavilion wasn't nearly as much of a draw as the Arch. Within a year of the pavilion's opening, it was closed. Tourists were still coming to downtown St. Louis, but they weren't coming to see the jewel of the fair. In 1976, the pavilion was purchased to become a hotel. A 20-story building rose over the previously open courtyard. Today, the structure remains a hotel, with little evidence of its previous life. The stunning concrete facade can still be seen, but it's lost in the noise and architecture of the hotel tower and surrounding buildings. At the fair, visitors to the pavilion were greeted by a bronze statue of Queen Isabella. Today, the Queen still holds court, relocated outside the Organization of American States in Washington, D.C. Even with many food options at the fair, one stood out: the Belgian Waffles.
Nice hot with strawberries on the top. And people would line up to get that.
The original waffle was served at the Belgian Village. When the popularity of the waffle surged, others at the fair rushed to add their own waffles to the menu.
It was amazing to see just how everybody that had an electric outlet plugged in a waffle iron and started selling it. The best ones came from the one family that made them for the Belgian Pavilion.
At the New York State Fair, you can still enjoy an original recipe Belgian waffle. Beyond fair organizer Robert Moses, Walt Disney was the man with the most riding on the fair. Disney and his Imagineers were responsible for 4 marquee attractions at the fair: Illinois' Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, GE's Progress Land, Pepsi's It's a Small World, a salute to UNICEF, and Ford's Magic Skyway. The fair gave those on the East Coast a taste of what it was like to visit Disneyland.
Disney was great for the fair, and the fair was great for Disney. I mean, you talk about a marriage made in heaven. Growing up in the East, you heard about Disneyland, but I don't know anybody that I went to school with that had actually been to Disneyland. And now Walt comes out here and he puts these shows down, and you go, wow.
Showing the kind of attractions that Walt had been doing in Disneyland was extremely important. In fact, Walt had several objectives to come out of the fair. One was to showcase Disney entertainment on the East Coast. Two was a stepping stone to Walt Disney World. And three was to build Disneyland up by bringing all those attractions back to Disneyland.
Walt was very smart. He simply told us they're going to pay for it and then we're going to take it back to Disneyland. And mostly all of it was taken down to Disneyland, where we built new attractions that would use what had already been purchased as far as the capital equipment, have either ride systems or animations or show artifacts. It was a very clever way of doing it.
World's Fair was a proving ground for a lot of his technology, ideas, and his vision as a cultural icon. And I think the New York World's Fair is has an enduring legacy, partially because of that, and partially because of the Belgian Waffles.
For GE's Progress Land, Disney created a unique rotating theater show in which the audience rotated around the actors. The Carousel of Progress was born. Some fair visitors believed they were watching live actors in the show, rather than animatronics, human-like programmable figures.
It was an interesting ride to be on because the automatronics were so new that people would come up to you after they had been on the ride and they go, "What was that lady's name? You know, she looks like my old secretary." So it was fun. It was fun to be kind of on the cutting edge during that time of something that was really new and exciting for people coming to the park.
GE's Progress Land also featured what was billed as a live nuclear fusion demonstration. In 1967, the Carousel of Progress opened in Disneyland without the nuclear fusion demonstration.
This was a really big deal when the attraction came back from the World's Fair, and they wanted to make sure everything was exactly right. So we had a lot of extra training on that. And yes, people were lined up because it was new and it was novel and it was big. The fact that the audience rotated was very new and novel, and people really did like that.
The Carousel of Progress moved to Walt Disney World in 1975. The carousel still goes round and round today. In the Illinois Pavilion, an animatronic Abraham Lincoln amazed guests.
The whole thing with Lincoln standing up and giving the speech, I mean, people honestly thought there was an actor, portraying the part.
And to watch him move and watch his eyes and watch his hand tremor a little bit, and as he got ready to get up, his hands would move very methodically to hold the side, to move him up. And for a moment in time, you were back in 1864. And there was Abraham Lincoln, right there on the stage, not talking to 350 people, but he was talking to you.
Prior to the World's Fair, Disneyland's animatronics consisted of the birds of the Tiki Room and simplistic animals of the Jungle Cruise.
That was a huge step forward in the development of audio animatronics because we had never done a figure that had to perform 12 or 13 hours a day, 4 shows an hour, that kind of thing.
The fair was also responsible for what would become Disney's most famous attraction.
Walt came in one day, we had a meeting with him, and he said, there's one more piece of real estate left at the World's Fair that's available. He says, I think maybe we'll get that. And there was only about 6 of us sitting in the meeting, and he said, I've got an idea for a little boat ride. We all kind of looked at each other like, ooh, has he lost it?
It's a Small World quickly became a fair favorite.
This magical exhibit called It's a Small World, I think I was at just the right age as an 8-year-old girl to be absolutely captivated by the magic that Disney is able to produce. It was almost just in my mind like a dream when I went through that exhibit.
When you get in that little boat in the small, small world, you're greeted by Goofy, Mickey Mouse, Daisy, and they're all waving at you, telling you to have a good time. And you would go in there and you'd listen to the music, which is hypnotic. Everybody that would leave that exhibit, that pavilion, would leave happy and sing the song.
Big breakthrough, I think, was in It's a Small World with the boat ride, because all of a sudden we were handling over 3,000 people an hour. And if you go back to the history of Disneyland, the first 6 years or so before we started working on the fair, you could handle maybe up to 2,000 people an hour on the Jungle Cruise. It enabled the Pirates of the Caribbean attraction, which opened in Disneyland in 1967.
As he had with the Carousel of Progress, Disney brought It's a Small World to Disneyland. However, a key icon of the fair didn't make the trip.
Rolly Crump and I have been friends for over 55 years, and I always admired his style. He has a very stylistic approach to doing things. And of course, the Small World Tower of the Four Winds was sort of Rolly's gigantic structure, hood ornament of Rolly type of ideas. And of course, when the tower got built, it was all the parts were twice as thick because it had to be for structural engineering reasons and wind loads. Rolly was very upset with it, but to everybody else, they didn't know his model was that thin. So when they saw the big full fat tube tower, they thought that was fantastic.
Oh, I hated it.
You know, like all our other exhibits, we checked the real tower out carefully before shipping it to New York. And here's how it looked when Roland and I went down and gave it a final dry run.
We subcontracted to a company, engineering company here in Los Angeles, and we built it here in LA. And I had to drive Walt down to take a look at it, and which we did. And Walt turned to me and said, "Well, what do you think, Rolly?" And I thought, "It's a piece of crap." And he said, "Rolly, it can't be a piece of crap." He says, "It cost me $250,000. And he loved it.
When the fair ended, there was a difference of opinion on what to do with the kinetic sculpture.
My boss, Dick Irvine, calls me in and he says, "Rolly, you're going to put you on the hot seat." And I said, "What?" So I went to the office, and all the vice presidents were in the office. And so he said, Dick Irvine said, "We don't want to bring the Tower of the Four Winds back to Disneyland." And I said, "Well, neither do I." And they said, "Well, we want you to tell Walt." Now, get this. I'm a guy in a pair of Levi's and a sweatshirt, and here's all the vice presidents in their ties and suits, and they don't want to tell him. They want me to tell him. And then finally at the end, Walt said, "Is that it?" And I said, and I used to grab his coat tail when he'd sit next to him, and I said, "Walt," I said, "about the Tower of the Four Winds," and that's when he'd frown, and the eyebrow would go up, and he says, "What about the Tower of the Four Winds?" And I said, "I don't want to bring it back." He says, "What do you mean you don't want to bring it back?" I said, "I don't. You know how I feel about it. I don't want to bring it back." He went to every one of those guys and said, "Are you concerned about the cost of bringing it back?" To the finance guy. "Well, a little bit, but not really, And then he went to one of the engineers. "Are you worried about engineering, the safety of it?" A little bit, but no, it's okay." So they were backpedaling with everything that he said, but then they would admit that they were a little concerned. Well, at that point in time, Walt knew that I had been set up. The man was absolutely brilliant. So he said to him, he says, "Okay, we won't bring it back."
What happened to the tower after the fair ended has become a thing of urban legend. Some believe it was dumped in nearby Flushing Bay. Most likely, it was sold as scrap and melted down. After some time in storage, It's a Small World opened at Disneyland. The same dolls and animals and song that enthralled fair visitors were entertaining guests again. Today, It's a Small World is an iconic part of Disneyland and 4 other Disney parks around the globe. Disney was also responsible for a pavilion that launched an American icon. At the 1939-40 World's Fair, Ford employed drivers to whisk fairgoers around in Ford vehicles. For the 1964-65 fair, another plan was developed.
This time around, Walt had the suggestion that, say, we'll just take some of your brand new cars and we'll just put them on a conveyor and move the vehicles with no drivers. That way we get more capacity and the Ford gets to show off the cars. So the job fell to me as to, okay, Smarty, you're going to figure out how to move these cars. You're a former car designer.
To move the cars, Gurr turned to his previous work on a Disneyland attraction for inspiration.
If you ride the Matterhorn, yes, it's a roller coaster because you take up a hill with a chain and it comes down the hills and the valleys. Has little wheels on the bottom that either speed up or slow down the cars to trim their speed. Aha, there's the way we move Ford vehicles. Well, that meant we had to have the bottom of the car have a device which we call a platen attached to the bottom of the car.
Not everyone knew Disney magic was propelling the cars.
This is the first time I had been behind the driver's seat of a brand new Mustang convertible. And I'm sitting behind there and I'm grabbing onto the wheel, trying to turn the radio on all the knobs, but of course nothing works, so they disconnected everything. And my hands are glued to the wheel and I'm steering there and we're going around the turn and I'm trying to steer around there. And a 6-year-old driving a car, you know, my family's lives depend on me, so I'm not watching any of the exhibits at all. I'm watching exactly what I'm supposed to on the road. You know, 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock, looking in the rearview mirror, doing all that kind of stuff, ignoring everything. After it was over, my parents had to pry my hands from the steering wheel, and wasn't that fantastic? Well, you know, I was trying to drive, I didn't see anything. So we had to do it all again. So I got back in line again, and this time my father said, just relax, look out the window, the car will drive itself.
As he had with other attractions at the fair, Walt Disney salvaged a portion of the ride for future use at Disneyland. Several of the dinosaurs became part of a prehistoric scene along the park railroad. The most prominent legacy of the Ford exhibit was the Mustang. But what became of the Mustangs on the Skyway?
We would never sell a ride vehicle out of Disneyland, but Ford said that, no, we're going to sell these cars after we use them each year on the attraction, which sounded kind of crazy.
In order for the Skyway ride system to work, the vehicles had to weigh roughly the same. This meant larger cars had to have their engines removed to reduce weight. The small, light Mustang was able to remain completely intact. After slight modifications like installing functioning radios and attaching the odometer, the Skyway Mustangs were placed on Ford lots for sale.
At that time, I couldn't really afford a new car, which was what they were, basically.
John Mansell's Mustang was one of only 12 from the first season of the fair. He bought it for $2,200. Then in 1965, he drove the car to the fair without knowing the car was originally from the Skyway. John's car hasn't lived a showroom life and has the marks to prove it. 400 miles away in Michigan, a 1965 Mustang from the fair has had a different life, culminating in a full showroom quality restoration.
Well, this is a 65 Mustang that I bought, my dad and I bought when I was in high school back in 1978, and we got it in Detroit. A mutual friend of my parents worked at Ford, and this guy had this Mustang he wanted to sell us. The guy kept badgering us, says, no, this is a really nice one, it's special. It was at the World's Fair in New York back in '65, and you really need to see it. So it had the special numbers on it and little brackets underneath when it was a Magic Skyway car. We didn't know anything about it at the time. And we took it apart, parked it in the garage, and it sat for 30 years in pieces. And a couple of years ago, my wife and I said, we got to get that car together. This is just ridiculous. This car's been sitting for 30-some years doing nothing.
In the summer of 2013, just as he was completing work on the Mustang, an incredible piece of luck led Schweitzer to another Mustang, the only other 65 Skyway Mustang thought to exist. And so the restoration process begins again. The fair would go on to influence the Disney company for years to come. On November 15, 1965, Walt Disney held a press conference to outline his plans for what was known as the Florida Project. Disney laid out an ambitious plan.
We call it Epcot, spelled E-P-C-O-T. Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow.
When Walt Disney died 13 months later, the company had to decide how to move forward with the Florida Project without his leadership. In 1971, Walt Disney World Resort opened with a series of hotels, golf courses, and a theme park, the Magic Kingdom. With over 27,000 acres of land under their control, the company had the opportunity to do much more than one theme park. When it came time to create the final design for what became known as Epcot Center, Imagineers looked to the World's Fair for inspiration.
In many ways, what we did with Epcot Center was the same. We had the Future World, and separately we had the World Showcase. It did have a big influence because companies were still willing to put their name on a pavilion in much the same way they did at the World's Fair.
I think that Epcot proper, is probably as close to the 1964-65 World's Fair as anyone can ever get.
Even today, when I look at the World Showcase and I look at Epcot, it's like, well, we don't have to have that many World Fairs anymore because we've got a very large one in the same spot that you can kind of modify it a little bit from time to time. But it's like the idea, a permanent World's Fair.
While Ford had the creative might of Walt Disney, they were certainly not the only automotive company to see tremendous promotional value in the fair. General Motors had an ambitious attraction named Futurama 2. The original Futurama was part of the 1939-40 fair and predicted a future of multi-lane expressways and interstate highways. By 1964, much of GM's original Futurama vision had become reality. GM hoped to top that exhibit with Futurama 2. This time, exotic locations like the rainforest were featured.
A jungle road is built in one continuous operation. First, a searing ray of light, the laser beam, cuts through the trees. Then a giant machine, a factory on wheels, grinds up the stumps and jungle growth, sets the firm foundation, forms the surface slabs, sets them in place, and the roadway bed is paved.
GM also highlighted its ambitious plans to be part of space exploration.
Yet here is man, exploring, building his first bridgehead in his span of space.
Chrysler took a more whimsical approach. A giant engine, along with a car assembly line ride, welcomed guests. Perhaps the most unusual part of Chrysler's attraction was a puppet show. Chrysler's plans for the attraction caught the attention of a young puppeteer named Jim Henson.
Jim was invited to provide concepts for the Chrysler Pavilion at the World's Fair, and that would have been at the very end of 1963. And Jim wasn't that well known at the time, so it was a really exciting opportunity for him. The concepts that he drew up for Chrysler involved some wheeled robots or things that were maybe in the family of engines or motors, and then also these sort of extraterrestrial type landscapes with characters that had wheels and rolled around. He was commissioned by Liebman Productions to do this. He had worked on a television special with them. Ultimately, Chrysler went with Bill Baird to build their show in the Chrysler Pavilion. Bill Baird was a much better known puppeteer at the time. He had been on television, for more than a decade and was really very well established and a friend of Jim's, but much better known, and he got the commission.
For Chrysler, Baird created the marionettes of the Show-Go-Round, a musical stage show in which the characters consisted of car parts and car care items. Today, a few of the puppets can be seen along with other Baird creations at the McNider Museum in Mason City, Iowa. Ball bearing manufacturer SKF, who supplied parts to all three American car companies, looked to the fair to raise its own profile.
It was the smallest site in the World's Fair, and it was in among the giants. How was I going to get people to find this pavilion and give it some attention when they were all heading over to GM and Ford and Chrysler? What we decided to do was bury the pavilion. It didn't have a very high profile, and then we decided, let's reach for the sky. And what we did was we turned an upside-down parasol, and at the top with the SKF logo.
The initial show had a lukewarm response.
For the second season, they wanted to do something a little more entertaining. So Jim created this robot who introduced and then closed out the show. His movements were programmed using punch tape, and they were timed to go with the soundtrack that had a lot of sound effects, dings and bells and things like that.
I am a robot. I was built by the people of SKF. Repeat, SKF.
Well, I think the animatronic element, the fact that he was programmed and didn't need a manipulator, was very interesting to Jim.
The revised SKF show was a hit, teaching millions about the value of ball bearings. America had car fever, and all those cars needed to be fueled.
A familiar name greets the visitors. And below the name, the most advanced and ultra-modern service stations, designed and built by Sinclair, especially for the World's Fair.
Founded in 1916, Sinclair Oil had grown to be one of the largest U.S. oil companies by 1964. The company made heavy use of dinosaurs in its marketing and led to the widely held belief that oil comes from dinosaurs, a concept the company had first pushed at the 1933-34 Chicago World's Fair. Most oil comes from the remains of microscopic life, but a single-cell organism doesn't make for much of a mascot. Sinclair brought this idea of oil from dinosaurs to a new generation with Sinclair Dinoland. Dinoland featured 9 life-sized replicas of some of the biggest and smallest dinosaurs known to man.
Like going to a museum and experiencing the dinosaurs in full life. And the dinosaurs have movement and sound. And I can remember standing at some of the dinosaurs that moved and made sounds. Little children would just be in awe. Some would hide behind their parents, and they would just stand there in total amazement.
The ferocious Tyrannosaurus Rex, the iconic Triceratops, the stately Stegosaurus, and of course, Sinclair's mascot, the giant plant-eating Brontosaurus. After the fair, the dinosaurs were first offered to the Smithsonian, and being rejected, a cross-country tour of the dinosaurs commenced. Since Sinclair was in the oil business and not the fiberglass dinosaur business, they donated the dinosaurs largely to towns that were key parts of the Sinclair pipeline. The Brontosaurus, now known as an Apatosaurus, and the T-Rex can be found in Dinosaur Valley State Park in Glen Rose, Texas, just outside of Dallas. These two giants are fenced in by 3-foot-high wooden rails, keeping them from going on a reign of terror. These two giants serve as greeters of sorts for the visitors who come to see the well-preserved tracks of real dinosaurs. Nearly 900 miles away, another Sinclair dinosaur keeps company with the bones and fossils of real dinosaurs. The Sinclair Stegosaurus sits outside the visitor center at Dinosaur National Monument, along the Colorado and Utah border. Sure, his looks may have changed since his time at the fair, but who among us looks the same after 50 years? The Corythosaurus can be found in Riverside Park and Zoo in Independence, Kansas. Hiding among the slides and swings of the park, Corythosaurus stands perpetually snacking on a nearby tree. Just outside of Chicago, Sinclair's Trachodon stands at the Brookfield Zoo. Overshadowed by the zoo animals around him, the Trachodon's history is unknown to most zoo visitors. Meanwhile, in Wisconsin, the smallest remaining dinosaur from Sinclair, the Struthomenius, quietly observes as two larger dinosaurs clash at the Milwaukee Public Museum. The Sinclair Triceratops was proudly displayed at the Louisville Science Center for many years. Then one day, under what seemed like suspicious circumstances, the Triceratops disappeared. Conspiracy theories began to spread, and the museum was quiet. Today, the Triceratops has been placed in storage, although its future is uncertain. And in Houston, the Ankylosaurus has been on display for decades at the Houston Museum of Natural Sciences. In 2011, the dinosaur took to the sky to move to another location during a museum expansion. Meanwhile, the whereabouts of the Ornitholestes remain a mystery. At around 6 feet long, this dinosaur could have ended up anywhere. A restaurant, a mini golf course, a basement, anywhere. Cars also needed tires, and the U.S. Rubber Company aimed to remind visitors of their tires in a big way. They constructed an 80-foot white-wall tire Ferris wheel to promote their U.S. Royal tires. The U.S. Royal tire can still be seen. Today, it stands outside of Detroit as a billboard for parent company Uniroyal. Although the car was king at the fair, it was not the only celebrated means of transportation. AMF, a company known today mainly for its bowling centers, wowed guests with its monorail. Constructed at a cost of $5 million, the monorail was a serious demonstration for the company, as it earnestly saw a future in the technology. After the fair, interest evaporated. The monorail cars were shipped to Houston, where oil operator John Meekum planned to sell them to the new Houston International Airport. The deal never happened. None of the monorail cars are believed to survive today.
Part of the fun of the World's Fair is the subway special that takes you there. There's a good
Railway travel was also celebrated at the fair. Along with the new subway cars that brought thousands to the fair, the Long Island Railroad had a strong presence with their own pavilion, the highlight of which was some waterfowl.
Peking ducks.
the famous Long Island duckling. And in the center of the pavilion, they had an area that was populated with young Long Island ducklings, and visitors to the Long Island Railroad Pavilion could go up and handle the ducks, pet them, pick them up, all while this G16 train set was running around the perimeter of the property.
Today, he oversees the operation of one of the few remaining fair attractions, the Long Island Railroad G16 scale model train.
The Grumman Corporation bought the train set from the Long Island Railroad after the fair to set up at the big picnic pavilion at Calverton. And they painted it all red with a white belly band. When Grumman was purchased by the Northrop Corporation, the G16 train was given to the village of Patchogue. Many people who have been on the train when it was at Flushing Meadows come and they bring their children and their grandchildren to experience it today. I went in 1964 with my dad and again in 1965. And both times, being a train lover, we had to go to the Long Island Railroad Pavilion so that he and I could ride on this train. And here we are 50 years later and I'm an engineer on the train.
A leisurely way to see the fair was from the air. The Swiss Sky Ride provided stunning vistas of the grounds. Long after the fair ended, those same gondolas transported guests for decades at Six Flags Great Adventure in New Jersey. The giant Sinclair dinosaurs weren't the only popular prehistoric item at the fair. Kids loved the dinosaur vending machines. Made in front of your eyes, the dinosaurs were a unique and sometimes imperfect souvenir. Injected plastic was heated in a mold and then dropped through a door in the front of the machine. Today, those same machines are located at science centers and zoos around the country. Dinosaurs were far from the only souvenirs at the fair. If it had room for a World's Fair logo, you could buy it.
The publicity machine for the World's Fair was absolutely incredible. Official shoes of the World's Fair, the official hat of the World's Fair. I mean, it got kind of amazing when you're looking at the official Scotch whiskey of the World's Fair. The number of endorsements and licensing that they did on it was really unprecedented.
Today there's a wide assortment of items and a large group of collectors.
Sometimes I get a little out of hand. I just love all this stuff. The basic blue and orange, the Unisphere, this very kitschy approach to the thousands of different items that they made. I just love it all. There's not one thing in my collection that I would give up for any sort of reason. It's just, I just love it all. And I think it's important that we save this slice of history.
There are larger remnants of the fair too. Special light fixtures, luminaries with colored panels dotted the fairgrounds. Several ended up at the now closed Penn Hills Resort in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. The property is for sale, and it's unlikely that new owners will retain the fair relics. The resort itself, with a unique contemporary shape, is rumored to have been built with steel from the fair. The luminaries also went to the Orange County Fairgrounds in Middletown, New York. They can still be seen lighting the Midway. Like Penn Hills, the fairgrounds are also for sale, clouding the future of these lights as well. A few of the lights, along with trash cans from the fair, can be found at Canobie Lake Park in Salem, New Hampshire. General Foods sponsored 11 giant arches at the fair. Serving as markers and meeting points, the arches offered news and information along with General Foods product info. Each arch carried the fair's theme, Peace Through Understanding. In front of a West Hempstead, New York shopping center, one of the arches still stands. Another marks the entrance to the Enchanted Forest Water Safari Amusement Park in Old Forge, New York. The full-sized Liberty Bell of the Pennsylvania Pavilion stands outside the Pennsylvania State Museum in Harrisburg. The Festival of Gas celebrated all things gas. The pavilion featured a rotating platform for viewing the attractions below. When the fair ended, the rotating platform found a new life in South Carolina.
President Jones at the time had gone to a meeting of university presidents in Tokyo and had seen a revolving restaurant. He was in the process of planning the dormitory that would go on this site and had asked the architects to do a design so that a revolving restaurant could be added to that design. As he then began researching where we could find such a device, he found the one from the World's Fair. It was within 3 inches of the size that the architects had already designed to go on top of this building.
The same platform that once ushered millions through the wonderful world of gas now offers diners a scenic look at Columbia, South Carolina. The technology from the fair has shaped our lives for half a century.
You could go over to the RCA Pavilion and not only see a color TV, which was, it's hard for people today to understand, the color TV was still really new in 1964, but you could also see yourself on color TV. You didn't have closed-circuit TV where you could see yourself in a department store on monitors or anything. This was probably where 99% of people were the first time they ever were in front of a TV camera. That was pretty neat.
While color television broadcasts began in the 50s, at the time of the fair, less than 4% of the televisions in America were color sets. By 1966, all 3 major networks were broadcasting their entire primetime lineup in color. At the Bell Telephone System Pavilion, another glimpse of the future awaited.
The main technology that they really wanted to showcase was picture phone. It was basically a monitor where you would see the person that you were conversing with. And you had a handset, and you would just talk normally through the handset. But the idea was to connect folks in a more intimate setting. It really was a technology ahead of its time. People would wait in line, and the hostess, the Bell System hostess, would greet them and invite them to come inside. And so one person typically would sit in each booth. There would be a picture phone set in front of them. The hostess would then interconnect that person with another person in one of the other booths, so you could have 3 conversations going simultaneously.
Although Bell's vision of a picture phone on every desk didn't come true, today millions have smartphones and computers capable of connecting around the globe via video. While fair buffs gather the trinkets and souvenirs from the fair, larger relics continue to vanish. The Austrian Pavilion was hailed for its unique suspended design. Massive A-frame supports suspended the floor of the pavilion 15 feet off the ground. The shape of the building fittingly echoed the shape of an alpine lodge. The pavilion moved to Cherry Creek, New York, to serve as the ski lodge for the new Cockaigne Ski Resort.
The 9 points of the building are so important. 6 on the ground and 3 in the air. Everything is suspended. The outside walls merely keep the cold out. When I first came here, the ground floor was not completed. The first thing I did was to enclose the base, which did a lot of things. It increased the size of the lodge and improved the ability to heat the structure immeasurably. A building that has historic origin and interest and should be preserved in its original site. We've tried to do that.
Fire swept through a local landmark last night. Massive flames erupted at the Cockaigne Ski Resort in Cherry Creek. The flames could be seen up to 5 miles away. The Lodge, a historic building from the 1964-65 New York World's Fair, is a total loss.
The most threatened relics of the fair might be those in Flushing Meadows. The New York State Pavilion was a marvel at the fair. Designed by renowned architect Philip Johnson, the pavilion featured a futuristic and playful Tent of Tomorrow cantilevered roof made of colored fiberglass panels. The pavilion floor was a large terrazzo map of New York State. The beauty of the pavilion, and really the whole fair, could be taken in from one of 3 platforms. Rising over 200 feet, the platforms were reached via 2 space-aged capsule elevators. The pavilion symbolized the imagined future of architecture and urban design. Today, the roof panels are long gone. Souvenir hunters have scavenged pieces of the terrazzo floor. The remaining floor has been covered for protection. The sleek Sky Streak elevators from the pavilion sit nearby, rotting from years of exposure to the elements. The stability and safety of the pavilion are uncertain. Still, hope remains. A small group of volunteers meets several times a year doing basic cosmetic cleanup, repainting portions to match the earlier look.
Well, we're doing the bottom portion right now, as you could see. But it wouldn't be fantastic if we had enough money where we could do the top portion and bring this baby back to life. If you do something like this, it's love, it's in your heart. You can't fake it.
Whether it's an open-air amphitheater, whether it's a garden space, there are many, many brilliant ideas that also include air and space museums. They go from simple to complex. But they all share a common spirit, which is the spirit of trying to save an important legacy from New York's past, to educate future generations of not just New Yorkers, but visitors to New York and people around the world on the importance of these great events, of World's Fairs and Expos.
Those towers should be restaurants or observation decks. I think it's a great area, and it makes me sad because we go back from time to time. We shot a little bit of Men in Black 3 at the World's Fair again, and I was really shocked and saddened by how in disrepair that whole area has become.
Personally, I find it to be an absolute travesty and a tragedy that we have these buildings that have been allowed to just deteriorate over the years. To be able to stand here and see something that was so iconic, to be able to look at the pictures from the past and compare it to what it is now, which is basically a modern ruin.
When I was coming to the fair back when I was about 13 years old, I was riding the People Wall. And one of the things I was thinking of is, you know, one day they're going to build another World's Fair here or somewhere. And I would be involved in designing it or designing one of the pavilions, or I'd be working at it in some capacity. Well, as you can see, I've got a hard hat on today, I've got my gloves, and we're up here painting. I'm back here now at 60 years old. Keeping the fair alive in a sense. When we walk around the fair, you know, a lot of from our group that do the walkarounds, we might see walkways where the original walkways were in trees, but in our mind we remember the pavilions.
Despite the current condition of the pavilion, its cultural value has been recognized.
It was listed on the New York State and the National Registers of Historic Places back in 2009. And listing on these two registers shines a spotlight on the cultural, historic, architectural, and engineering significance of the structure.
Today we're celebrating something that in a way is even more of a triumph than getting this pavilion built. It's a special pleasure to be able to announce now that the National Trust for Historic Preservation has named the New York State Pavilion a national treasure.
The 50th anniversary of the fair brought the National Treasure designation for the New York State Pavilion, and the gates to the pavilion were opened once more. Thousands came to Flushing Meadows Corona Park for a glimpse into the pavilion.
To come here on class trips, I came with my parents. Anybody who was going, we lived just down the Van Wyck, so anybody coming up this way, all the kids would, you know, say, "Can you take us? Can you take us?" And I have such great memories of it.
It was my best childhood memory. I mean, the World's Fair, I was 10 years old, and I really loved it, and it was Disney World and then some, you know, for a 10-year-old from Brooklyn.
And I was such a proponent of the fair. I love the World's Fair. I was so disappointed when they took it down.
It was always this interesting fixture of history that was sitting here in Queens, and you know, I appreciated it. And it's cool to actually get a chance to see the inside.
This is part of us, you know, in our upbringing, our childhood. We came to the park, this is what we saw. We were too young when it was the World's Fair, but we grew up with these structures.
At this point, I really believe that we're going to see the New York State Pavilion restored and looking beautiful again. I guess in the back of my mind, I was hoping that by doing it in Iron Man 2, that people would the conversation would begin again. Because it's there. And it's still awesome. The grounds are great. People still gravitate to that park. You know, why not do what we were talking about in Iron Man 2 and have people demonstrate new technologies and have a destination fueled by social media? It's in New York. It's not like you're asking them to go to the middle of nowhere. You know, you just got to go to Queens. I know it seems far.
In June 2014, it was announced that $5.8 million had been allocated to begin restoration of the pavilion. While a full restoration will take more than 10 times that amount, it's the first significant move towards preserving the pavilion in decades. Next door to the New York State Pavilion, the Queens Theater occupies the space that held the Theaterama, a 360-degree film celebrating New York State.
We're standing inside the Theaterama right now, which was a Circle-O-Rama movie theater with movie screens all the way around showing a panoramic film focusing on the state of New York. When you walk in the door, you really just sort of get that sense and you get that feel that a lot of history has happened here, that there is something notable that took place. And you may not be able to put your finger on exactly what it was, but there's just something in the air. There is a certain charged electricity that says this was important, and it still is.
Other former pavilions at Flushing Meadows Corona Park are also flourishing. The Hall of Science, along with the U.S. Space Park, gave visitors a glimpse at current and future space travel.
Originally, there was no Hall of Science, but Robert Moses decided that, with some persuasion, that it would be important to have that as part of the fair. So he went to a designer called Wallace Harrison, an architect that had done a lot of work for the Rockefellers, and asked him to design the building quickly. The story is that Wallace Harrison had a plan for a religious building, a cathedral, that he took off and modified for this building. When visitors came to the Hall of Science in '64, they entered through here. And they had a movie that was Frank Capra's last movie that was called Rendezvous in Space.
Will his muscles get flabby? Or will his bones go soft? Without gravity pull, will the heart and the circulation remain normal? Or the brain? And how about groceries, where there are no celestial supermarkets?
Keeping pace with science discoveries and remaining engaging to today's visitors has required several renovations and a doubling of exhibit space. Still, the original building remains.
We have 500,000 visitors every year. The visitors are the United Nations, just as you'd anticipate in Queens, and we have lots of ways of engaging young people and thinking about science. So I think the original conception of the World's Fair, which is to engage a broad audience in thinking about science technology, has carried through to the Hall of Science as it currently is.
Another Flushing Meadows building had a noteworthy life before the fair began. The building that housed the New York City exhibit was originally constructed as the New York City Pavilion for the 1939-40 World's Fair. Later, it was home to the United Nations from 1946 to 1950. In 1964, the main attraction was the meticulously crafted panorama of New York City. 835,000 buildings were represented. Visitors saw the model from the sky, taking a leisurely trip in a helicopter mock-up. The helicopters are gone, but today visitors can take a longer look at the city below.
The panorama of the city of New York is kind of the heart of the Queens Museum. You don't have to speak English, you don't have to love contemporary art to love this model. It's the largest architectural model in the world. People are amazed at the scale of it. A comment from one of the kids on a school group. He walked into the panorama and he said, "Wow, I've never seen New York City so big." And it is really big, but it's also incredibly small. For a museum to have something that took 100 people 3 years to build, that's sort of beyond the capacity of a museum this size to have that kind of budget.
The Queens Museum recently expanded, taking over the vacant half of the building that held an ice skating rink during and after the fair. The museum expansion adds 50,000 square feet of exhibit space. At 140 feet tall, weighing 900,000 pounds, the Unisphere, billed as the biggest world on Earth, was the key landmark of the fair.
I know it's 12 stories of earth and 2 stories of pedestal, so it's 14 stories of glistening stainless steel. And it is, from an engineering standpoint, it's a marvel, but aesthetically, it is a work of art.
The structure was deceptively difficult to design.
Each structural member of Unisphere must appear light and attractive. Perched atop a sculptured base, which must suggest lightness and grace, Unisphere would have to withstand the enormous and changing forces of the wind, as well as its own weight. The continents and islands would act like sails, and wind pressure could exert forces nearly equal to the weight of the entire structure.
This one striking giant structure captured the smallness of our world.
There are few greater pieces of eye candy in the United States than the Unisphere. It is big and bold. You can tell from looking at it that people had to think a long time and do a lot of hard work to figure out the math behind putting together that kind of a structure. What it symbolizes is so clean and clear and powerful to this day that the world has literally been to Flushing Meadows more than once. The Unisphere is a great piece of Americana.
For VIPs, the way to make an entrance at the fair was via helicopter. The Port Authority heliport stood 120 feet above the ground on the roof of a T-shaped building. The building housed the top of the fair restaurant and featured a short film on Port Authority projects around the city. The heliport is gone today. The Port Authority building serves as a banquet facility with stunning views of the park. One World's Fair pavilion that moved after the fair ended barely moved at all. The fair had its own pavilion hosting performances and shows. With the death of Winston Churchill in January 1965, the pavilion became a Churchill tribute for the second season of the fair. The building's iconic geodesic dome moved to another corner of the park to become the aviary of the Queen's Zoo. Parts of the Singer Bowl, a large open-air stadium, survived to become a portion of the National Tennis Center, the complex that hosts the U.S. Open each year. And there's one mystery lurking in Flushing Meadows. Could an entire World's Fair pavilion be hiding in plain sight? Or it would be more accurate to say hiding under plain sight. The underground home gave fairgoers a chance to imagine living underground in a home complete with a patio and gardens. The exhibit was the brainchild of contractor Jay Swayze. With atomic age fears fresh in people's minds, it made sense to try to market the home at the fair. But what happened to the underground home once the fair ended?
My opinion is the underground home is still there. You think about the situation back at that time. You've just lost a fortune exhibiting at the World's Fair, and you've now got a chance to get out of Dodge. You can either go off and spend all the money to rip the roof off the building, tear out all the walls, fill in the hole with dirt, tamp the whole thing down, and spend, I don't know, make up a number, $50,000 to clean up your mess and go home. Or you could go to the guy that writes the building permits and say, hey, here's $500, sign it off, and I'm out of here.
I think the underground home is not there. I think that when people were required to demolish their pavilions and remove them to a certain grade level below ground, even if the underground home was below that grade level, I think Robert Moses would have said, no, we're not having a pavilion hidden under the ground somewhere. It's got to go.
I believe what is the structure of the underground home is probably still there. However, I think that they caved it in. They made holes in the bottom of it. Because think about it. I mean, here you have something, I think the corporate records, they said that they had to be 6 foot of new earth put on top of anything. So in theory, all you had to do is just put 6 feet of earth on top of it, and you had to make it drain well. So I think they took out everything, you know, as far as the curtains and the beds and the desks and everything. I think all of that is gone. But I think probably the shell is probably still there.
I do believe the underground home still exists. I don't believe it exists in the form that we took great dramatic license with to create for CSI New York. I think it's probably a lot muddier. I'm sure they took the furnishings and decor out. I would be surprised if it's structurally sound at all, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if some part or pieces of the underground home are still there.
Trey Calloway weaved the underground home into a 3-episode storyline on CSI New York, with an elusive killer living in the underground home in modern-day Flushing Meadows. But CSI New York is far from the only show to visit Flushing Meadows. Men in Black used the saucer-like structures of the New York State Pavilion as a key plot point.
Part of the reason why the end of Men in Black takes place at the World's Fair was because I attended it. I grew up in Washington Heights, which is in Upper Manhattan, and I probably went to the World's Fair in '64 and '65 70 times. And we were looking for something for the end of Men in Black that was iconographically both New York, but somehow symbolically of a bigger area. Early in the movie of the first Men in Black, Tommy Lee Jones, while trying to recruit Will Smith, shows him the first spaceship that landed, which is a flying saucer. And he explains to Will that they built the entire World's Fair around this flying saucer. And in fact, the New York State Pavilion had these 3 circular sort of flying saucers. And Will Smith says,
"So these are real flying saucers, and the World's Fair was just a cover-up for their landing."
And Tommy Lee Jones says,
"Why else would we hold it in Queens?"
Maybe no movie has used the World's Fair for inspiration more than Iron Man 2.
What would it be like if, in this alternate reality where Howard Stark is a character, if you had the World's Fair was, in fact, the Stark Expo, way back when, and now in our universe we use it as an analog for as if the World Fair had existed now, and Tony Stark is bringing back the Stark Expo. We developed different pavilions that as they would exist now, and that became our backdrop. And for me, it was great. And my whole vision was to have him land right in the middle of the New York Pavilion and him kick off this big, like, TED Talk type Stark Expo event with inviting people to change the world in the name of technology. And to set it there in the World's Fair was really fun for me because I got to, see this thing come to life that I've only seen the ghost, the skeleton of.
Doug Drexler was a designer on several Star Trek series, but in 1964, he was just a kid at the fair who couldn't get enough of the futuristic designs.
Yeah, the fair had a huge impact on who I would eventually become. It probably was one of the first times I realized that there was a place for people. People had to make this stuff. People had to design this stuff. Who worked on this? That giant model of New York City, and somebody did this. And it was just the kind of stuff I love to do. I could see the influence that the New York World's Fair had on Star Trek. I'd watch the show and I'd say, that's New York State Pavilion. Many years later, Matt Jeffries, who was a production designer on the original show, ended up being a dear friend of mine, and we could sit and talk about it. And I found out that sure enough that he was at the World's Fair, and when he came back, there was a message from a guy named Roddenberry, and that he wanted to do a show called Star Trek. So there are bits and pieces of the fair, and we carried that on with the later shows.
It was Robert Moses' wish for Flushing Meadows Corona Park to become a pristine model park for New York. The park serves as a lung of sorts for the city, a place for the city to catch its breath. A welcome rest from a hurried pace or stressful commute. A seemingly endless backyard for kids who might not have one of their own. Diverse activities and quiet moments have made it a true gem.
Having worked at the World's Fair and experienced the fair firsthand, and to have gotten paid for it was certainly one of the top 5 experiences in my entire life.
It was beautiful. It was like another world, you know.
It was an amazing place.
And those kids who were 8, 9, 10, many of them were influenced by what they saw at the fair into what they would eventually do and become.
It's hard to believe, you know, the impact of something you do when you're 12 is, you know, going to stick with you for the rest of your life like that.
Wouldn't it be great if we could get everybody in the world to think the way of the words that Bob and Dick Sherman wrote for that song? You know, there's just one moon and one golden sun, and a smile means friendship to everyone. Imagine if you could get everybody in the world to relate that way to other people.
I mean, that's the promise of a World's Fair, is everybody works together.
Through its innovations in technology, impact on pop culture, and influence on people, the New York World's Fair will be with us forever.
Ba, ba, ba.